Hi, welcome back to another episode of Real-World Serverless, a podcast where I speak with real-world practitioners and get their stories from the trenches. Today, I'm joined by an AWS Serverless hero, Ken Collins from Custom Inc. Hey, Ken, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. How you doing?
Yes, it's good to finally meet you virtually. So you've been working at the Custom Inc. for quite a few years now, and you've seen this whole transition to serverless. Can you maybe paint us a picture of who you are and who is Custom Inc. and your journey towards serverless?
Yeah, absolutely. And first, thank you so much for having me on the show. I think I've looked up to a lot of your articles, and I think you really helped me on my personal serverless journey. And I just wanted to make sure I thanked you ahead of time for that because all the work that you do, I believe with Lumago, I'm not sure if I pronounced it right. It's just been immensely helpful. More so, your deep knowledge dives onto all these topics, and I just really appreciate you having me on it and doing all that work that you've done for the community as well.
Thank you. Really appreciate that.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't go unseen. I do appreciate it. About Custom Inc. I think let's see, I might be on my 8th year there, and personally, I'm on my 2nd year of my sort of retooling of my personal skill set on learning to use the cloud well. I think if you would have asked me a couple years ago hey Ken, if you knew the cloud, I probably would have told you I've made an S3 bucket and I pretty much know the cloud really well, and I knew what EC2 meant. And the more I learned, the more I know I didn't know a lot of things. And that's really where my career has been over the past 2 years. If you frame that with Custom Inc., Custom Inc. is a business that's been for printing t-shirts, has been in business for almost 20 years now, maybe 20 as of this date. And there's a lot of history with Custom Inc. with Rails and Ruby. And I think when I joined there about 8 years ago, we only just started to understand like the breaking points of our monolithic applications. Traditionally, they would be a big front end and a big back end and maybe a legacy Java back end. And, I watched us move from having servers, manually installed by us to like maybe about 3 or 4 years ago, where we sort of had our big lift and shift into the cloud. And I've slowly sort of been adopting and learning serverless and optimizing a lot of our more performant workloads that sort of are under stress as we start pulling them out of these sort of bigger applications.
As you make that transition to serverless, what were some of the early pain points? One of the things that I hear a lot from customers who are going through a similar journey that you guys went through a couple of years ago is that, well, suddenly, as the application developer, you now have to learn a lot more, whereas before you just write your own application code and a lot of the infrastructure is handled by other teams. But now every developer have to know about all these different AWS services. Everyone have to be suddenly capable of wearing different hats. You have to know about architecture. You have to be, responsible for those decisions. You have to know about DevOps, infrastructure as code, and all of a sudden there's put a lot more onus on those developers. Is that something that you guys experience as well?
Oh yeah, and that's ongoing too. I don't think we've reached our finish line yet, and if there ever was one, it's probably at least a few years out. And I think that's an honest part of like some of these processes that we talk about, DevOps and sort of cloud adoption and whatnot, that we might not talk about honestly enough, which is that this is a process and you really have to work at it, and it's really hard. And there's some outcomes that we all wish that this has, but it's it's not turnkey, and it takes a while. And I think for us, if I can sort of like frame how we've approached it to date, is one, understanding where we got serverless right. And that was basically, I think we have a testimonial on the AWS Lambda page around our usage of it. And we just took this one Rails application that was extracted from another Rails application, and we saw that we needed a rendering path for our clip art service, which you would experience if you were in our design lab, where resizing and adding clip arts from our collection would sort of call out the image magic, rasterize it, bring it back into the JavaScript application and render it for the browser. And we had to move that to a sort of more performant, more scalable system where we didn't have to sort of keep scaling up these EC2 instances and whatnot. And we got like an immediate cost savings as well as sort of a capability expansion. And for 2 years, we've just been duplicating that story over and over again. And then that sort of brings on these other conversations of where do you apply that knowledge? What are the standards that you adopt on, say serverless framework versus SAM? And then how do you go out and sort of evangelize within the company that these are things that you can do? And then once you're there in the cloud with these certain frameworks, what are your capabilities that are different that weren't there before that make solving other problems easier? And it's just an ongoing process. It never stops.
Certainly with AWS, everything is changing, everything's evolving all the time. There's never an end to your learning. In fact, as you get closer to reInvent, they're going to announce more and more things. It's going to be pretty hectic every year just to keep up with all the feature announcements and new services they do around this time of the year. But you mentioned something earlier that it was you moved to serverless and immediately got some scaling benefits and some performance benefits. Was that a trigger? Was that a particular problem with that application whereby you're running into scalability issues or running into other issues that made you have a look at serverless at that time?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the engineer before me that implemented that particular Lambda for our clip art library, he, one of the things, even though he was sort of embedded, that particular engineer in our web ops team at that time, he had this capability to sort of look and sort of shoot by a lot of our processes with Lambda, right? Lambda allows you to get sort of this code working out there faster than it normally would take, even if you're in the cloud, right? Like it would, I would imagine for anybody that's in a company that's over at least 50 or so people, there's going to be processes in place for maybe spinning up an EC2 instances or other things like that. And serverless allowed us to get this really good architectural win with very little effort that was traditionally looked at before on what it would take to sort of like properly architect something and spin it up and test its viability.
So with serverless, one of the promises is that you can do things faster, and sounds like you guys have definitely benefit from that, from the fact that you're talking about being able to test features or ideas in the market quickly. Has that been something that you have seen in the Custom Inc. as a whole, whereby as more and more teams adopt serverless, things are just getting delivered faster, and because of that, you're getting more adoption and momentum within the company?
Yeah, it happens slowly, and then like if I described maybe from a scale of 1 to 10 where we are, I'd probably put it at a 2, and I'd like to be at 10. But then again, I live and breathe everything Lambda, and for me, it's hard not to see every problem being solved by it, or at least sort of focusing on a particular way of our architecture of always utilizing it. I think the one use case that I haven't really seen us exercise a lot, that's sort of very nascent and still there and just ready to be tapped into, is this sort of internal usage by your teams where you sort of can do this sort of entrepreneurship where you can take and start sort of like either a new business idea or a new application to help sort of an internal team or some sort of process out and just spin that up on Lambda. And we're only starting to get into that. We've done a few of them and we can see the value. But again, it takes a while to go out to the different teams and sort of to train them and to let them know that they have these tools that can sort of do this thing. Otherwise, they're just going to keep doing the same thing they've always done before.
And speaking of tools, you also mentioned earlier about the choosing between serverless framework and SAM. What do you guys decide to go with, and what's the reason behind it?
Well, I think so as a principal engineer there, I was sort of assigned go take a look at this serverless thing and try to figure it out more and sort of standardize it for our teams. And I took a heavy look at serverless, and SAM was just coming out right when I started adopting things. So I do think I had an advantage from my point in time where, back in the day, a couple years before when I adopted serverless and Lambda, your solutions would be much different than mine because you were forced to have these solutions, right? There was no SAM back then. So when I looked at both of them from a fresh pair of clean eyes, the thing that I was struck by with is the serverless framework is I felt like I was being forced to learn a couple things at the same time, and I was having a really hard time doing that, right? Like CloudFormation was new to me, infrastructure as code was new to me. All these things were so new, and I felt like with serverless at least, I had to learn this framework and then the framework underneath of it that was driving it, i.e. CloudFormation. And when I looked at SAM, I saw that they were essentially the same thing. So I was like, well, let me just go ahead and learn the raw language. And I feel like that's paid dividends over the course of the past few years that Sam's just been getting better and better and better. So I adopted Sam. I wrote up all of our processes for it. And slowly as Sam's been getting better, as AWS is getting better, we've been just buying into it more and more. And I realize there's probably people out there that like serverless, and by all means use the tool that's right for you. But I've never looked back from Sam. I think it's a great tool.
Yeah, personally, I've always gone with the server framework because it just provides a lot more flexibility. One of the problems I've run into with SAM on a couple of client projects is that because SAM has no, I guess, the equivalent to a plugin system that the server framework has, it means that I'm kind of stuck with what this framework does and its decisions. So there's no easy way for me to disagree with the decisions that SAM has taken without some drastic changes on the framework itself. A couple of times I've had to take a really hard, I guess, a detour and wrote a custom macro just so that I can change some settings that SAM sets and doesn't give me the option to change. Whereas with the server framework, and I can always override what the framework decides to do before I deploy. That has been something that I guess has stopped me from embracing SAM more because of that. Oftentimes, I just run into things that, no, I just can't do anything. I end up running into a brick wall. Whereas with a server framework, there's always an escape patch.
What's one of the things that you run into a wall about with with SAM?
So the last one was when they first announced support for AWS IAM authentication for API Gateway. So at that time, when you enable AWS IAM, it also changes how credentials is passed through. So that it also changes the credential attribute on the API Gateway method integration, which means the caller's credentials is then used to invoke the Lambda function, which means as a caller for your API, I have to have the IAM permission to execute the API Gateway endpoint as well as the Lambda function behind it, which just breaks the abstraction layer. They have since then changed it so that you can actually set the value to override the credentials. But I was on a project, I was going to deliver within next couple of days or couple of weeks. I couldn't just wait 6 months or however long it takes the SAM to make that breaking change. So that was one that I remember very clearly, that I had a deadline to meet, and I have to do something drastic and ship a CloudFormation macro just to change that one line of configuration in the CloudFormation that SAM generates.
Yeah, very interesting. I think the one of the counterpoints I found with that is, like, I guess every time that I've had a sort of a blocker for SAM, I've ended up working around it in either process, right? So like maybe after the CloudFormation stack would deploy through my own sort of automation scripts, I might do like an API call to sort of like stitch things up together and stuff like that. One thing I recently learned about a difference between SAM and serverless is that within SAM, to me, it was always very natural with the policies section to just sort of be very declarative in how I state the permissions that my Lambda has the capability to do within the execution role. But I learned that that was sort of like a plugin that you had to use with serverless and whatnot. So there's probably a lot of give and take. And I will definitely say that I think I stay a little bit more higher up on the use case. Like I've never done really any custom IAM authentication. Most of our stuff that we've been using at Custom Inc. is just super dumb HTTP proxies, right? Where we've been getting a lot of value at just, basically looking at API Gateway as almost like an application server.
Yeah, the IAM per functions thing has been on my wish list for server framework for a very long time. But that also is an argument for serverless, that there's anything the framework can't do, there's probably a plugin that does it.
Yeah, check. Yeah, I would say that that's probably like just maybe an SDK call right after the stack.
Most of the server framework plugins, they modify the CloudFormation that the framework generates. That's what that particular plugin does as well, that it lets the framework generates the CloudFormation and then it adds its own resources based on your configuration.
Cool.
I guess maybe changing the topic slightly, something that we were talking about just before we started the show was this idea of putting existing frameworks into Lambda. So taking an existing, say, Express.js app, or Python's, I guess, Flask app, or the equivalent will be Ruby on Rails, into a Lambda function. That's something that you guys have been doing quite a bit, right?
Yeah, I would say we have a very healthy mix of what some would call proper use of Lambda and also some would call the improper use of Lambda. Um, I definitely have a different perspective than most people in that I don't come with a computer science background, and I traditionally um, do things in a way where there are no rules, only outcomes, right, or goals. So I try not to tell people this is right or this is wrong. I always try to advocate for people to try to figure out what's right for them, what's right for your company, and where you are is probably a lot different from where other people are and their company. So the thing that I tried to look into here was after we had done a couple of these lambdas, mostly in Node.js before Ruby was introduced as an official runtime, we had noticed a pattern or lack thereof in our Lambda work, right? Like as you approached each node project, maybe how you did routing, which would also be a taboo law to break for a lot of people in Lambda, was different, right? The POJOs would be different, the structure of the project would be different and stuff. And one of our engineers asked me the basic question. He's like, Ken, could there be any more sort of structure in these lambdas? I don't think he thought maybe the outcome of me would be like, well, let me just put Rails in it. But that was my natural first idea. Is like, like, I mean, we're basically just using these things as, commoditized web servers and, web proxies. So that spawned the idea of like, well, will rack, which is the HTTP abstraction in Ruby, can you convert that event that comes in to a rack event? And I quickly found that AWS sort of sanctioned this, if you will. They had wrote a little open source project that took the exact same structure for Express and basically converted the HTTP event to a compatible event that you could send to the Express application in Node. And I was like, well, if they can do it, I can do it. And I totally did it. And I love it to death. And I think everybody, there's this conversation to be had of like, I'm taking certain bets on Lambda that sort of after watching Simon Wardley when I went to my first serverless conf and was probably the only one now because I don't think we had one since in 2019 in October, where he sort of like preached about this commoditization of this sort of architecture that I totally buy into. And if you sort of believe that and you believe that's where the puck is going, and sure, they can be these small little, functions as a service thing, but they can also be this incredible architecture that we can build on top of that abstracts below the waterline, all these things that we don't really care about, but yet we want, right? Everything from auto scaling to, a commoditized HTTP server, et cetera. And I've been having a lot of success with running Rails and Lambda, and I just think it's a great idea, and it seems to be gaining popularity, right? Like AWS itself is advocating for PHP frameworks, and I think we just recently got a serverless hero, I forget his name, that is working on the Symfony framework inside of Lambda, and perhaps others have done it as well, not just with Express, but maybe with Python as well.
I definitely think it's valuable to have as a way for people to lift and shift existing application into Lambda and get some of that benefit in terms of scalability, in terms of better security, because you don't have to worry about securing the OS or some of the networking side of things as well, which is so complicated to get right, and it's very easy to get wrong. But I think there's still an argument against having it as your goal in terms of that's where you can end up with. Because in terms of getting the best performance, best security from Lambda, at some point you probably do want to break up your function so that instead of having one function that does routing internally and handles every endpoint, I guess an example of that would be I had a customer who was doing that and it was fine because they managed to get this project running, porting the API to Lambda very quickly and got something out the door. Which is great, but they were mixing up some endpoints that had to do server-side rendering. So there's some endpoints that required React as a dependency, and with Node.js, the more dependencies you have, the longer your code style is going to be, which means every endpoint, even if some of them didn't require React, in fact, which is most of them, they still suffered from the fact that, well, the whole function needed to initialize its dependencies, which included this big dependency for React. And also they had this issue whereby they have different resources they need to access, which means every single endpoint can potentially have access to everything that the whole API can do, which is something that's if you talk to AWS guys, they will often tell you that at some point you do want to break it up, partly because of that security reason. It's no longer an issue now, but also for this particular customer, they even had this problem with, one endpoint had to talk to something inside of VPC, which means the whole API has to be inside of VPC, which back then means that you had like an occasional 10-second response time because of the fact that VPC adds 10 seconds to your cold start, which thankfully is no longer an issue. But I do still think that at some point, there is enough benefit to do some of that re-architecting and taking your functions, taking your API endpoints and putting them into single-purpose functions as opposed to doing all your routing. However, CloudFormation doesn't really help you here when you have got a large API because there's all these limits around 200 resources and a few other things which I find that there's often practical reasons that kind of forces you to put routing into in your own functions because you just run into all kinds of different service limits. But I do agree that it's great to have an option to be able to lift and shift your application into Lambda without having to do a big rewrite, because a lot of time that's just not feasible.
Yeah, and I want to be like super clear on this too, that I think, a lot of people, when they hear us talk about these things on like, this is right or that is wrong, right? Like you have to really sort of take that with sort of context, right? Like not everybody is Netflix, not everybody is Custom Ink, and not everybody is, somebody else. So like for us, it was easy for us to see maybe after 10 years that one application that served our product data probably shouldn't be serving the S3 content as well, and doing the binary stuff. So it's easy to say like, hey, let's take that out. Let's put it in a Lambda. Let's re-architect the stuff around so that we can do these things better. But like we were very successful for 10 years with that poor architecture. I wager that a lot of people, once they start getting involved with Lambda, whether it be through either microservice optimization first on an existing infrastructure, or if they're creating new things, will find these right breakout points and abstractions sometimes from the get-go, but sometimes maybe a couple years later, right? And that's fine, right? Like, so like one workshop material I did where it teaches Rails developers like, hey, here's a little microservice that you can do with S3 for image resizing. And typically in a Rails application, you might use something called active storage. And, people would just throw this app up on, say, Heroku, and, one controller action would be uploading, binary data, much like our product system, and would be serving that binary data back out again through a Rails controller through, send file or something. And, stuff like that, I think is if you want to do it in a big Rails app and at some point later on abstract it out, fine. But, those cases are so common in Rails that I thought a workshop was really good showcasing how you could break that out into its own microservice and get that architectural win. But, make no mistake, I think people should do that when they need to do it, right? You got to take data to this, and you got to have business value first, and you just sort of like don't let the technical aspects of it and the sort of correctness of it drive you first. Get your business win, get your stuff together. And the good thing is you're not locked into anything. We're engineers. We can do anything we want later on down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with what you said earlier, that don't advocate for rules, but advocate for outcome, because it's sometimes it's just good to take that to take on some technical debt, or just do it the hacky way if it means that you get something out, be able to test it. Who knows? Maybe once you test the idea, it's not idea that's worth building on. So why spend weeks or months of work trying to do the right solution when you can test the idea first with maybe a couple of hours work and doing it the hacky way.
And there may be like I've definitely talked about this on Twitter before, and there's different people. Like I think one of the things with Custom Ink, since we'd been around for a while, I think in 2014. If I remember correctly, that's when Lambda was sort of first introduced, right? And we had a business unit that was successfully started as a whole other business unit with its own Rails monolith. And in 2014, microservices and sort of smashing these things into oblivion was a very popular topic to talk about. And what happened is that for us, we had this one business unit that went off, took this monolith, and went to go build it right this time, right? Like it was only 6 months old, and they're like, we're going to smash it up into a bunch of microservices because microservices were important. And, we lost 2 years of business traction because that was not the right outcome, right? Like that was not where the engineering fit. And eventually we brought the product back in-house and back into our core platform with the monolith, and all that work was wasted. So like, we've got corporate memory around that and lessons and stuff. So I always want to advocate that, if you're a brand new company and maybe the microservices first, or, we now have the tools to do that right for the first time, that may be good, right? Take that choice, right? Look at it. Be smart about those decisions. But I've seen it both ways, right? And I think it's, there's never one approach. And I definitely lean towards small apps to monoliths and breaking things up when business success lets you know you need to break it up.
Certainly, I've seen enough. What's the polite way to say this? Technical masturbation. I've seen that happens so often. It's teams getting, especially I guess there's a lot of teams that believe in certain ways of building software is the right way, and you do kind of find yourself go down a really deep rabbit hole and kind of lose the big picture, which is it's all about a business. It's all about adding business value. And with serverless, that is the thing that enables us to do. But at the same time, it's a new paradigm, new tools, new way of doing things, new ways to just tweak things and just trying to solve engineering problems rather than solve the real business problem.
Yeah, and there's fun ones in AWS. I mean, like I'm still learning every day. Like I think we did a project a couple weeks ago where I did that classical AWS Lambda thing where we had a huge migration of our product image bucket to a new one, and we needed to switch to that abstraction I was telling you about, where we pulled the image assets and serving from our Rails to a microservice, and we had literally, I think we computed it out to 147 days of a single compute work to do, and we did it in an hour, right? Like with AWS, we architected the events, we got everything set up with our queues, and basically we started off that bucket migration and moved over to the new platform. And that was amazing, right? Like, and these are the things that you learn when you start adopting this framework. And I think if we can get more people from full stack applications into AWS, into Lambda from that point of view first, without telling them, you're doing it wrong, and do that lift and shift and get them into this ecosystem and get them learning about other ways that they can do things, not so that they can waste time, but when they do have to do that migration or that next big thing on some sort of proper event-based architecture, the capability is at hand versus, let's lift and shift first.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're running Express app in the Lambda function, it's probably more scalable and more secure than if you're running Express app inside an EC2 instance or on a container. And also you have room to grow, like I said, at that point, as when the business dictates that you need to be able to split things up, maybe into a separate API, into separate microservices, or to start building a more event-based system on top of your existing application. I want to switch gears again and talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you see on a day-to-day basis. Because certainly there's a lot of complaints from people that are getting to serverless nowadays about the lack of ability to simulate services locally. Testing and observability are quite common issues that people run into. Are there anything that sort of stands out for you guys, particular in terms of challenges that you face as you're working with serverless technologies on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think you called out a few of them that were sort of top of mind. Let's see if I can go down a couple of them. One was the testing with sort of like local services, right? So like we have one application that was a new application for our process and creative teams, which used DynamoDB and Rails and S3. And for us, at Custom Ink, we have development accounts. So we use what I think most people agree is a good AWS strategy of, a single AWS account for staging, a single AWS account for production. And then we have basically shared, development accounts like Alpha, Bravo, or Charlie. And what happens is that for the development process, especially at least within Ruby, your language may vary, but creating an S3 instance or creating a DynamoDB table with a couple of lines of code, like Rails would do it for either a DB create, versus Postgres or MySQL, is very straightforward, right? So if anybody were to come into, say, one of these applications where we basically have native cloud resources set up, you just run a couple scripts and you have as long as you have Git, Docker, and an organizational AWS development account set up, then you can get started working on this application locally with remote resources, and it just feels like a native application. But I do think there's a huge market for as things get a little bit more complicated, right? Again, I think we're sort of afforded that a lot of our resources that we use are kind of shallow, right? So it might be hard for some people to set up SQS and SNS and a whole bunch of other things that we've never really crossed that threshold in the development environment, right? So that probably comes into this use case of how you do testing. Again, sort of like a lot of our decisions are informed by Rails. So for us testing, it's easy to test our Rails apps because we have things like unit functional and integration tests. And since we've basically used API Gateway as a proxy or just sort of a commoditized web server, and Rails already has a web server built into it, we don't have to couple our sort of testing to, understanding if API Gateway is going to work with things, right? That's tested at Lambda. We don't have to test that for our framework. So we basically just test our full application at the various components that we like to, whether it be unit or functional or integration. And a lot of our image architecture is using image diff tools and other things like that, so that we can sort of go from high to low and feel fairly confident about things. And then, if it needs to work with API Gateway, right? I've seen people complain that, oh my God, API Gateway, HTTP API, it's V1 and V2 silently switched, right? You'll find that out in staging as you move it through the pipelines. So we try not to do too much testing that tests things in the cloud, right? That's where we use our multi-stage strategy.
Okay, yeah, that's such an interesting thing that I haven't thought about. That the fact that you're running an application, HTTP server inside Lambda, does give you some of that benefits in terms of making it a bit easier for you to just reuse existing testing methodologies, and it will still just work once it's running in the API Gateway. But I guess as you're doing more and more event-based systems, that probably is not going to be true anymore. And certainly I find that with some of the more, I guess, complicated or complex, rather, events-based systems I've built, some of the biggest difficulties when it comes to testing is being able to verify that your application is sending the right events to places like EventBridge and to SNS. And I have to have a very elaborate environment set up so that I can essentially listen on events that's going to those queues or topics, just so that I can verify that, okay, when I'm calling my function or when I submit an event, the Lambda function that runs is doing the right thing in terms of writing data to DynamoDB, but then also publishing the right events so that other systems can listen to. So it's just doing that end-to-end test on the contract that goes in and the contract that goes out.
That's an interesting story because we've never really done the so that migration I mentioned earlier where we did the the product images. So we that was all done in Ruby, say with libvips and stuff, and all those are tested that one's not in Rails at all. It's basically just your good classical Lambda microservice, and we just basically test the events with SAM by either loading the Ruby up into memory and just sending the handler the event and making sure everything goes naturally underneath it. But that I think that word you said is smoke test, right? Once you deploy everything, make sure it's working. And that's kind of interesting, right? Because we wouldn't do testing, you test one thing and then you test another thing. And if there's an API contract, right? Testing that they sent that message, it's something we typically don't test, right? If the interface is XYZ, then you better send it XYZ.
Yeah, some of those things can get more and more difficult to test. But I guess it also depends on the type of system you're building and
Yeah.
how much confidence you have about your application. I think there's a lot of this you can still test at a unit level. So, for example, for some of these event-based systems, I can still run unit tests that invoke the function locally and using mocks and stubs to capture whatever request we're actually trying to send to SNS and to Event Bridge. So that's okay to test what a particular function does, but certainly at some point you want to test the whole thing end to end as it's been deployed to AWS to check that IAM permissions and a bunch of other things that are set up correctly. One of the things that's caught me out a few times is while my testing the function locally, that it's all fine, but I actually forgot to add the SNS publish permission to the function. So when it's deployed, it's not actually publishing the message to SNS. So the end-to-end flow for that particular workflow was broken. And luckily, we had end-to-end tests to capture some of that, even though we didn't validate maybe absolutely everything. But the fact that we execute them in AWS caught some of these bugs that would have otherwise been missed if we just rely on testing functions locally or testing individual functions as opposed to the entire end-to-end flow.
Yeah, I'd imagine that's pretty hard. I don't think I've ever really sort of approached that problem, um, right? Like you just kind of have to have trust in probably your systems, but then again, like that end-to-end test sounds important. I'm not sure exactly how I would approach that. Like it's if it's a Plinko game, like how do you test, that you drop it in the top and then it comes out the bottom every time, and in this case, it hits all the right like pegs at the right time and stuff.
Yep, and the more different, I guess, the more different branching logic you have along the way, the harder it's going to get as well in terms of test cases. But again, it's not something that I do all the time. But some teams I've worked with where the system's highly critical, so they put more importance on try to catch as much of the possible failure modes during testing as they possibly can. Other teams may lean towards having better observability and monitoring in place so that if something goes wrong, they can deal with it quickly and it's not a showstopper for them to maybe have occasional bugs and maybe those events doesn't get processed right away and goes into the queue so that they can then reprocess them later. Whereas other teams are building things that are real time and has to be processed within a few seconds, and it's just, super important, especially those that's in the sort of finance world where there's tend to be more weight put towards getting things done right the first time as much as possible, even if it takes longer. Whereas other teams, especially for smaller startups, it's more of a we need to ship tomorrow. It's okay if it's got some bugs, we will live, but we need to ship tomorrow.
Yeah, I think I came up with a term the other day when thinking about some event terms called eventual financial consistency, right? Like uh it's a very going pure event driven, I think is a threshold we haven't quite yet crossed in our needs yet. And certainly there's a lot of empathy there on how you do that stuff and do it well that I've had yet to sort of really address.
I don't think being event driven should be a goal. It's like I said, right? It's about the outcome. It's got pros and cons, like with every decision we make. But certainly, it is a very powerful way to build certain type of systems. Give you a lot of properties that you would like to have. Things like being loosely coupled, also being able to replay events and things like that. I guess we've covered most of the questions I have. One thing I do want to also ask you about as well, and this is something that I tend to ask everyone I interview, is what are some of your top AWS wishlist items?
Oh, that's a great question. Let's see. So I think, wow. Let me think about that, right? Like, I think a lot of them have just been coming true naturally, right? Like, so, I had mentioned that a lot of the work that I had done sort of is this bet on serverless and making a bet on the Lambda ecosystem and commoditization. So if you asked me this maybe a year ago, I would have mentioned things like RDS proxy and let's see. So maybe going further back to there, I would have been like, okay, the VPC cold starts. I don't know, right? Like I think the AWS team, from what I've been working on, has been doing a really good job at sort of anticipating where things are going and getting things done. I think, so I've had very few AWS wish list items that I think falls in their camp, right? Like that they could fix, like some of them in weird services like CloudFront. I think can't remember I wish they had like an allow list versus a deny list on the query parameters. But with an AWS Lambda, let me think. I'm going to dramatic pause. Let's see.
It doesn't have to be Lambda. It could be, like I said, the other related services. Could be API Gateway, CloudFront, or anything, or even SAM.
Yeah, with SAM, I think I want them to have HTTP API support soon. Please, pretty please. Because like some of our older microservices, especially with Node, we use Jest, which is a testing framework, I think, written by Facebook. And it's really nice, right? It has this one capability where you could sort of write environments. Like I think the default environment is, I think it was the Node environment or a DOM environment. But basically, I wrote a SAM Jest environment, which will automatically allow some of your tests to spawn an AWS SAM local start API. And because these certain Node microservices don't actually have their own web server like we do with, say, Rails. And I would very much like to switch those to HTTP API, which, as your posts have said, it's 60% cheaper, 70% faster, or was it 60% faster and 70% cheaper? And I've coupled my Node microservice to SAM starting the API so that I can do my integration test right there with the SAM framework. And until they support the start local with HTTP API, I'm a little bit hamstrung on getting that deployed out because I don't want to write a lot of code to sort of abstract that away and switch it to a different type of HTTP method. So that's my number one.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's a good one. HTTP API is, I think, 70% cheaper on the per million request cost compared to API Gateway, REST APIs. But I tend to find that that whole 50% faster to be overplayed because it's only talking about the latency overhead the API Gateway REST API adds, which is typically 5 to 10 milliseconds. Which even if you are 50% faster, you're talking about 2.5 to 5 milliseconds of latency savings, which is not nothing, but it's probably not where your problem is if you've got performance issue.
Right. It's like those JavaScript micro benchmarks, right? Like here, this library does this faster, but put it in a real world application, it doesn't really matter, right? Like, but yeah, most of our API gateway usage is with north-south image architecture. So most of our time is on the backside.
Cool. So is there anything else you can think of? It's okay if you don't. I guess that just makes you a very happy AWS customer.
Yeah, it does. I love what they're doing. I support everything they do. Every time they bring something new out to the market, I'm like, that's what I was waiting for. And I'll continue to do my part to advocate it. I think EFS was another one that I didn't know it was coming. And, that has sort of enabled us to, I'm literally today, maybe next week, writing a whole Rails lift and shift for one of our most transactional services that is going to be unlocked by EFS. So they do a pretty good job of anticipating when I need to get my job done.
And now that you are an AWS Serverless hero, you've got an inside track to give them even more feedback, and also I guess you've got better connection to the team so that you can tell them your requirements and what you're going to be working on next and what you're going to need from them.
Absolutely, they do treat us well.
All right, so I think that's everything I've got. Ken, again, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your story with Custom Inc.
Yeah, and I really appreciate it. I really do. Thank you for all the work you've done too.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And take care and hope to see you in person at some point.
Yeah, I can't wait for the real person stuff to start again. Cheers.
Cheers. Bye-bye. So that's it for another episode of Real-World Serverless. To access the show notes, please go to realworldserverless.com. If you want to learn how to build production-ready serverless applications, please check out my upcoming courses at productionreadyserverless.com. And I'll see you guys next time.